Interested in learning about wine, but not sure where to start? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine podcast. I'm your host, Haley Bowman, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm a wine enthusiast turned wine educator and founder of the Seattle-based wine tasting business, Cork and Fizz. It is my goal to build your confidence in wine by making it approachable and lots of fun. You can expect to learn everything from how to describe your favorite wine to what to pair with dinner tonight, and so much more. Whether you're a casual wine sipper or a total cork dork like myself, this podcast is for you. So grab yourself a glass and let's dive in. Welcome back to another episode of the Cork and Fizz Guide to Wine. If this is your first time here, welcome. So glad you're tuning in. And for those that listen every week, thank you so much. I love it. I love that I get to make these for you. Today's episode is all about wine aromas, and we're gonna get a little nerdy. It's gonna get a little geeky, but I feel like in the best way. I think this stuff is so cool. But before we do that, I have to tell you about a story that was before I was into wine. It was actually the trip that I took that got me into wine in the first place. But when my husband and I went down to Willamette Valley in Oregon, and I drank wine, but I didn't know a whole lot about it. And, it was just my alcohol of choice, you could say. So we went on this trip, and I have a very, very particular memory. We were in this one tasting room and we were trying their Chardonnay. And I was convinced that this Chardonnay had to have pineapple in it. They had to have added pineapple juice of some kind. There's no way this wine could smell so much like pineapple. Oh, and coconut. It was pineapple and coconut were two flavors. And I remember asking the person working, I'm like, how does this smell just like coconut and pineapple? Did you put that in the wine? Why does it smell like this? She's like, no, that's just the way wine works. It creates these aromas that remind you of other things. And so ever since then, I've been obviously enthralled in the world of wine. It threw me into this entire hobby and passion and now business, which is so cool. And so I want to tell you about how we get those aromas in wine, where they come from, so you could know a little bit more about why you're smelling something in your wine, even if that's not actually in your wine. So I feel like a lot of people are very self-conscious about aromas. I feel like the detecting aroma step in wine tasting is the one most people are nervous about. But for one, it takes practice. There's actually proof out there you can improve your sense of smell. We all think that dogs have an amazing sense of smell. They can smell way more things than us. Actually, humans can smell more things than dogs. We just aren't trained to do that. Also, keep in mind that there are two reasons you may smell something in your glass of wine. So today, we're going to focus on the scientific reason, aka there is a chemical compound in the wine that is also something in something else that you recognize the smell of. I think that'll make sense once we start going through some examples, so stick with me here. Another reason you may smell something in your wine, it simply reminds you of it. And we have no other words, at least in the English language and in a lot of, the romantic languages, I think is what you call them. There really aren't a lot of words for describing smells other than comparing it to things we know. I think it was in the Cork Dork book with Bianca Bosker. And if it wasn't that, it was another wine book. But they talked about interviewing some people from an indigenous tribe, I want to say somewhere in Europe, and talking about, or maybe it was, I couldn't tell you where it was, but it was a tribe that was not in a first world country, but they had in their language different words to describe smells. And so when they gave them a piece of cinnamon gum versus when you gave an American a piece of cinnamon gum and asked them to describe it, that tribe had way more words and way more ways to explain what they were tasting and what they were smelling, versus here in the US, we might have just said it's spicy, but then, oh, what does it smell like? It reminds me of something. It's right? It's you can only think about what it reminds you of. And even then it's hard to come up with the name. So anyways, the whole idea of aroma, it's a difficult thing to just do off the bat. My thing that I say during my tastings is like, it's not like you were in kindergarten and somebody had you smell a blueberry and then go, okay, remember that. That's the smell of a blueberry. Because we don't do that, right? When we smell things, we think they're good or bad, not this smells like da 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 da. So, anyway, keep that in mind. But like I said, we're about to get real nerdy. I'm going to talk to you about the scientific background and what things are in your wine that might be in other things and why you're smelling something. Just a quick reminder, if you are not on my mailing list yet, what are you waiting for? I would love for you to join. When you do, you'll get a free shopping guide that has 15 of my favorite wines under $15. Head to corkandfizz.com, scroll down to the bottom, and there'll be a little section where you can join the mailing list. I send out a weekly newsletter filled with wine tips, recommendations, special offers, and so much more. Now, let's get back to the show. So starting off, we got to do some history. You know I'm a total history nerd. So as early as the 4th century BC, humans had already given up on smell. It was kind of deemed one of the not as great senses or not as useful. Aristotle had declared that the sense was not accurate and worse than with many animals. He believed humans could only perceive smells that were painful or pleasant, remember, good or bad. And he just didn't think it was accurate. He couldn't determine why, but it had always been seen as like the lesser of the senses since then. It wasn't until the 19th century that the scientific explanation for our poor, and you can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes around poor, for our poor sense of smell emerged. Paul Broca, which you might know for his more famous discovery of the region of the brain responsible for language development, aka Broca's area. But Broca examined brains and began to see a pattern. The more creatures ascended the evolutionary ladder, the smaller their limbic lobe was. And your limbic lobe contains the olfactory bulb, which means the thing that determines what you're smelling. So basically, the better you smell, the less evolved you are. Now, it's true that we have fewer olfactory receptors. And right, this olfactory bulb is smaller. It likely died off when we developed full color vision. It wasn't necessary anymore. However, it might be smaller, but it is attached to a more advanced brain, which offsets any of those losses. So yes, we can smell as many things as a dog can smell. We just choose not to train that part of our brain most of the time. But talk to a perfumer, talk to a professional sommelier. They have learned these smells. Now, before we get into what things are in wine, I feel like we kind of need to know a little bit of science of smell. So I am not a scientist by any means, so take this all with a grain of salt. But I'm going to give you kind of the basics of how we smell. So olfaction, just the fancy science word for smell, depends on the interaction between the odor stimulus and the olfactory of epithelium. This is the membrane or lining of your nose. The olfactory membrane is a sensitive area and it covers 4 to 6 square centimeters in each nostril. The nerve cells that primarily sense odors and fragrances are located in this membrane. Cilia extend from the nerve cells into the mucus layer. I know this sounds gross, but it's good to know, which greatly increases the potential receptor area. The cilia are thought to contain the ultimate olfactory receptors, which are specialized protein molecules. Now, there are many theories that have been proposed to describe the mechanism of smelling odors. Most can be classified into one of two groups. There's one that is a physical theory and one that's a chemical theory. Now, the physical theory proposes that the shape of the odorant molecule determines which olfactory cells will be stimulated and therefore what kind of odor will be perceived. So they're basically, it's almost like imagining like that little kid toy that has like the square and the circle and the triangle. And it's kind of that idea where this one fits the circle and then you'll smell this and this one fits to this, obviously much more complicated, but you kind of get the idea. Now, the chemical theory, which is more widely accepted, assumes that the odorant molecules bind chemically to protein receptors in our membranes and in that cilia. The type of receptor in each olfactory cell determines the type of stimulant that will excite the cell. So this is saying instead of it matching up physically, there's a chemical reaction that determines what you smell. Now, the last thing before we get into the science of wine aromas, I have some science fun facts for you because I thought these were cool and I just wanted to share them. So, did you know that humans can distinguish 5,000 aromas. 5,000. Like, that seems unbelievable, but we can actually train ourselves to distinguish that many aromas. Smell often identifies the presence or absence of odor rather than quantifying its intensity. So, this is interesting actually, especially when you compare it to other senses. So, the detection threshold concentrations of substances that evoke a smell are slight. So, that basically means that we don't need a lot of a smell to smell it, right? We only need a little bit. However, a concentration only 10 to 50 times that minimum, right? The least that we need to smell it. Go 10 to 50 times that. That is the maximum intensity that can be detected by humans. Any more than that, and it just smells the same to us, right? So it's like the difference between like a little bit of the smell and a lot of the smell is not very big. Now, look at this for other senses. So, the maximum intensity of sight, for instance, is about 500,000 times that of the threshold intensity, and a factor of 1 trillion is observed for hearing. For this reason, smell often identifies the presence or absence on the other side of odor rather than quantifying its intensity. So, you never say, like, oh, it smells a lot like this. You would simply say, oh, it smells like this. So basically, you smell it or you don't. Now, abilities vary when it comes to smell. There's a 1,000 times difference between the least and most sensitive in a study that was done recently. In general, females have a keener sense of smell than males. Smell blindness does exist. It's called anosmia. You can have it altogether, not be able to smell anything, or you have like anosmias towards certain smells. That is far more common. Olfactory nerves atrophy with age. So there's actually, it shows that as you get older, you're able to smell fewer things and it decreases quite rapidly. So it says from the time of birth to the extent that only 82% of your smell remains is by the age of 20. Then by the age of 60, you only have 38%. And at the age of 80, only 28%. So it's pretty significant. And then lastly, this was just kind of funny. Infants tend to like all odorous materials. They don't have a problem with things that we as adults might say smell bad. During a study, they showed that children younger than 5 rated sweat and feces as pleasant, but above that age as unpleasant. So there you go. You don't know that something smells bad until somebody tells you it smells bad. Okay, now let's talk about some good aromas. Hey, let's talk about some wine aromas. So, the science of wine aromas. So, behind those countless flavors that we sniff is a molecule. And these molecules are tiny clusters of carbon atoms generated during the grape ripening, alcoholic and malolactic fermentation, and wine aging processes. There are 3 types of aromas. So that's what we're going to break up today's podcast on when we're talking about the different wine aromas. There are varietal aromas. These are smells associated with the wine variety or blend of varieties. So remember, variety is the grape. So like Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, Sauvignon Blanc, all that. So just smells that are associated with that grape variety. Then you have fermentation aromas. These are flavors associated with microbial respiration, which is just a fancy term for the yeast eating those sugars, the fermentation process. And there's some off-gassing aromas, as you can say, that let off some aroma during that process. And then finally, you have aging bouquets, which I love that this one just sounds so much fancier. These are aromas that are derived from the breakdown of chemical compounds with time, temperature, and oxygen. So let's start with our varietal aromas. So these are also called primary aromas, and these happen through vine metabolism as the grapes mature. A lot of them are created as a survival technique to make the grapes either A, more attractive for animals to eat and spread the seeds around, or B, to make them less attractive to pests wanting to eat the vines. There are 3 main categories of varietal aromas. They are terpenes, methoxypyrazines, and thiols. Now, fun fact, you can't perceive certain primary aromas. This is because they're bonded to other big compounds that prevent them from volatilizing or basically floating into your nose. It's like they're too heavy. And if you think this is bad, you're like, oh man, come on, I'm missing out. If all the aromas were immediately perceivable, the wine would have a very intense aroma for a very short time. Fortunately, these hidden aromas are kind of released over time. This might also be why you smell something in your wine 30 minutes later than when you first poured it, which I think is kind of cool. So I mentioned there were three main categories of varietal aromas. So you have terpenes. This is the first one. So if you ever smell rose petals or maybe citrus in your wine, it is due to terpenes, which reside primarily in grape skins and are abundant elsewhere in nature. You find them in blossoms, fruits, and leaves of a lot of different plants. Terpenes are a class of compound that make wines like Muscat and Gewürztraminer super fragrant, and they give the characteristic citrus flavor to Riesling. So here are a few that you might recognize. One is linalool. This terpene, in connection with others, causes the perception of lavender, orange blossom, lily, and even bay leaves. You have geraniol. This compound causes that telltale smell of rose petals. Nerol and citronellol. Behind those compounds, they create that floral, citrusy scent that you would find in numerous flowers and fruits, and of course, our wine. And then these are starting to get into the numbers and the fancy science stuff. So it's called 1,8-thenol and alpha-pinene. If you regularly smell eucalyptus in your Australian red wines or the scent of like a garrigue, that is like the lavender and the low resinous plants that you find a lot in southern France, you're not fantasizing. That is these compounds. They give that eucalyptus tree smell and also shrubs like juniper and rosemary. And then finally, rotundun, which this is one that's a little more familiar to me. So you may have heard me say this once or twice. Rotundun is also a terpene. So since red wines are fermented on their skins, highly aromatic and stable compounds can make it into the wine. So rotundun is better known for its pungent aroma that it gives peppercorns, particularly white pepper, but also black pepper. It's just not as strong. So if your Syrah or your Gruner Veltliner, even as a white wine, and get some of it, smells a bit like pepper, you are smelling rotundun. Okay, our next one is called methoxypyrazine, and it's most known for its shortened term, pyrazine. And there are four major compounds within this, but we're not going to go into the details. That's getting a little too geeky for me. But pyrazines basically smell like green peas, grass, earthy, green pepper, or just like musty green aromas. So this is why when you smell, let's say, a Sauvignon Blanc or a Bordeaux red variety like Cabernet Sauvignon, Carmenere, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, they have that smell that reminds you of green bell pepper. It's because it has pyrazines in it, which is also found in a green bell pepper. Kind of cool, right? This is one of those that is a natural bug repellent. So the vines developed it to try to keep the bugs away from it. All right, our last primary aroma that we're going to talk about is thiol, or the category of thiols, I should say. A thiol is a compound that smells fruity in tiny amounts, but in larger amounts, it smells like garlic, and it can be considered a wine fault. But thiols are also a building block of earthiness in our wines. So, in lower concentrations, you can get the smell of grapefruit, and this can happen in Vermentino, Sauvignon Blanc, and Colombard. You might also get black currant, and that'll show up in red Bordeaux, like Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. Now, if you have it in higher concentrations, but still not too high, we're not getting to garlic yet, but slightly higher concentrations, you might get the smell of coffee. This is common in a Sonoma Pinot Noir, or chocolate, and that's common in an Argentinian Malbec. Okay, like I said, there are three kinds of aromas that you can get in wine. We just covered all of the different primary aromas. These are things that come from the grapes themselves. The second type of aroma you can get is fermentation aromas, also known as secondary aromas, right? We're keeping it simple. The primary, now the secondary. This podcast is sponsored by Repour Wine Savers. Listen, I love wine, but that doesn't mean I want to drink a full bottle every night. You see, it's always a risk opening a bottle knowing I'll only have a glass or two. But now I don't worry about that at all because I have Repour. These little contraptions will keep your open bottles of wine good for up to 3 months by removing oxygen from the bottle using fancy chemistry. And they're so easy to use. I simply open a bottle of wine, cork or screw cap, just like normal, and enjoy my glass or two. Then, when I'm ready to call it a night, I rip the foil off my Repour wine saver and place it in the bottle in place of the cork or screw cap, and then stick the bottle in the fridge. Simple as that. Then, whenever I grab another glass from that bottle in the future, I just make sure to put the Repour back on as soon as I'm done pouring. It's that easy. Want to give Repour a try? Head to repour.com repour.com, and use code CORKANDFIZZ for 10% off your order. That's repour, repour.com, and use code CORKANDFIZZ. No spaces in that, and the and is spelt out, so it's CORKANDFIZZ. Once you have repour, you'll never have to worry about opening a bottle of wine just for one glass. I mean, heck, now you can try 2 or more wines at the same time and have your own at-home wine tasting. This podcast is sponsored by the Cork Crew Virtual Wine Club. Interested in trying new wines, but not sure where to start? Or maybe you've been listening to this podcast for a while and you love the idea of tasting wine live with me. If that's you, come join my Cork Crew Virtual Wine Club, and you'll get to sip wine with me twice a month while I help you find new favorite wines. The Cork Crew is not your ordinary wine club. This is a community of people who are passionate about exploring new flavors, learning about different wine styles, and having fun along the way. And the best part about this club, purchasing the wine is completely optional. Plus, all events are recorded, and you have access to the full library of recordings as a Cork Crew member, so you can always catch up if you can't make it live. Oh, and did I mention it's virtual, which means you get to do all of this from the comfort of your sofa in your PJs. No need to worry about driving in crappy traffic, finding a designated driver, or spending an arm and a leg on a taxi. Want to give it a try without the commitment? You're in luck. Right now, I'm offering a free class pass to anybody who wants to try out the Cork Crew Virtual Wine Tasting Club. With this pass, you'll be able to join a Cork Crew event of your choosing. No strings attached. I don't need your credit card. I don't need you to sign up for anything. You'll be my guest. Simply head to corkandfizz.com/free class pass to get your class pass and be one step closer to becoming a member of the best wine tasting club around, the Cork Crew. I can't wait to see you there. Now let's get back to the show. So these come from fermentation. So during alcoholic fermentation, the yeast eats the sugar, right? We always talked about this. If you've ever seen one of my tastings, I always say yeast. It's like Pac-Man. Imagine that, little yellow video game figure. Yeast is going to go around and eat all the sugar. The sugar is the dots. So yeast eats the sugar and it produces alcohol and carbon dioxide, but it does so much more than that. A yeast cell is just like a tiny chemical lab that produces a large variety of molecules, including esters. Esters are particularly strong right after fermentation and can smell super vinous in like apple, tropical fruit, or even red berries. This is why Beaujolais Nouveau has a lot of fresh fruit smell. Beaujolais Nouveau, if you've never heard of this, is the wine that is released nearly within 90 days of harvest. So they release it and sell it almost immediately after fermentation. Also, you have these tiny bacteria. So you have regular fermentation that turns sugar into alcohol. You also have malolactic fermentation, and this is caused by tiny bacteria, actually. And these put out buttery, toasty, spicy, and even nutty aromas. So going a little deeper into the different types of fermentation aromas, first up, you have acetone and diacetyl. These are from malolactic fermentation, and they cause these sweet butter or cream smells, which, note here, do you see this compound is what causes your wine to smell like butter? It's not from the oak barrel that you put the wine in. Oaky Chardonnays are known for having a buttery smell to them, but it doesn't come from the oak. It comes from malolactic fermentation, and it comes specifically from this diacetyl compound. And I actually learned from a winemaker as well. If malolactic fermentation goes all the way through, so if you allow the fermentation to completely finish, so the malic acid, which is the acid you'd find in like an apple, gets turned into lactic acid, which is the acid that you'd find in butter. And if you let that fermentation go all the way through, you won't have any diacetyl in your wine. But if you stop it part of the way, or if it gets stopped and maybe the winemaker isn't physically doing it, but something happens, that's what leads to diacetyl in their wine, and that's what causes that butter smell. Now, we already talked about esters, right? Esters are volatile flavor compounds created by reaction between alcohols and acids, so they're created during fermentation. Esters are responsible for primary fruit flavors that we get in very young wines. So some different types of esters that you might see: isomyl acetate and ethyl acetate. These cause very young white wines to smell of pear drop candy or a mix of banana and pear flavor. These result in some of the two very common esters. You also have octyl acetate. These are aromas of orange and citrus fruit. And then you have butyl acetate. And this ester smells of red, delicious apples. Now, fun fact, esters are used extensively in the flavor industry for everything from essential oils to candy. Another type of fermentation aroma is your ketones and diketones. You have your beta-iodine. This is a compound that creates the haunting scent of violets in Pinot Noir and Syrah. You have beta-damascenone. Probably didn't say that one right, but I'm trying. This is a ketone that gives floral aromas with an undertow of red fruit. And then diacetyl is also considered a ketone. So we talked about that earlier. That's that like buttery kind of smell that comes from the byproduct of malolactic fermentation. And then finally, another fermentation aroma that is a little odd. It's called TDN. The full name is 1,1,6 trimethyl 1,2-dihydronaphthalene. I was going strong there. But just remember it as TDN. And if you're a Riesling fan, there is a chance that you have smelled this chemical compound. It is the smell that gives Riesling the smell of like petrol or gasoline. It's actually something that's also found in petrol or gasoline. Again, it's not actually meaning that your wine has gasoline in it. Your wine is totally safe to drink. It's just the chemical compound that is giving that smell. And so you're associating it with other things that have that. Okay, our last type of aromas, we talked about primary aromas. Those come from the variety. We talked about secondary aromas. Those come from fermentation. Finally, we are at our tertiary aromas, also known as aging bouquets. Wines that age in tanks, barrels, or bottles cause these different bouquets. There are three mechanisms that make these. You have chemical reactions, oxidation, and wood flavors. So we're going to dive into these a little bit. So starting first with oxidation, and this process creates aldehydes. So when wines age in terracotta tanks or wood, they experience micro-oxidation, which can produce compounds like acetic aldehyde. Some specific aldehydes include hexanol. This is responsible for the freshly cut grass and tomato leaf flavors that you might find in Sauvignon Blanc. Vanillin, another famous aldehyde. This is the chief flavor of vanilla beans. If you smell vanilla in your wine, it's probably vanillin. Then you have benzaldehyde. If you ever come across the scent of like bitter almond or marzipan, this is very common in aged Pinot Gris or some Italian white wines, you are smelling benzaldehyde. And then furfural, this is reminiscent of dried wood, caramel, and wheat bran. This chemical often occurs in oak-aged wines. Next, you have lactones. So lactones, and particularly gamma lactones, are esters found in sweet and creamy smelling foods such as honey wheat bread, peaches, coconut, roasted hazelnut butter, and even cooked pork. That one's an odd one, I have to admit. But it also develops in wines that have aged. So three particular ones. You have sotalone. This lactone is formed in wines that have aged, and it's associated with boitricized wines in particular. So those are the wines that are created from grapes that have developed noble rot. So it's actually where a little pinhole is created in the grape, sucks out of the water, basically creates the grape into a raisin, and then you press that. And that's all created from this noble rot that does this. So Sauternes is one that does this a lot. Also can show up in long-aged wines like Madeira. So depending on its concentration, it can smell of curry spice, nuts, toast, or maple syrup. Then you have octolactone. This compound comes from aging on oak, and it smells of coconut. And then eugenol. This smells like cloves or allspice. And then finally, our last example here of the aging bouquets. So we talked about oxidation, lactones, and then there's also phenols. And these are also known as Brettanomyces. Phenols are a group of chemical compounds that are similar to alcohols. They're naturally occurring in a lot of things, including sesame seeds, peppers, and even cannabis. In wine, one type of phenol is a wild yeast called Brettanomyces. It can add either a lovely clove and bacon aroma or a detestable horse barnyard kind of aroma to your wine. Okay, these last aromas, so we talked about primary, secondary, and tertiary, or better known as varietal fermentation or aging bouquet/aromas. There are some other aromas that you can find in your wine, and I just wasn't sure where to put them, so we're just going to call them the other group. So the two other ones that I want to call out, One, or actually, I think maybe I have three in here. One is called Geosmin, I think is how you say it. Geosmin, Geosmin. It's an organic compound that's created from a type of bacteria. It's going to be like the most earthiest smelling compound out there. If you love beets, mushrooms, and the smell of potting soil, then Geosmin is your friend, and you're going to find it in a lot of Pinot Noirs. Bacteria presented in wine can cause volatile acidity, aka acetic acid. In high doses, volatile acidity smells like acetone, aka nail polish remover. So we don't want that. But in low doses, it can add a lot of great complexity and feature of many fine wines. So in Chianti and Amarone della Valpolicella, you might find the aroma of balsamic. And oddly enough, in red Burgundy, you might find the smell of pickles. I don't know if that's ever happened to me, but supposedly it can, and it's caused from this volatile acidity. Last one, Botrytis cinerea or noble rot, which we talked about earlier. It creates a couple other compounds that we didn't mention. So this is frenulum that creates smells of caramel, pineapple, and strawberry, along with phenolactaldehyde. I think I said that almost right. That creates aromas of rose, cinnamon, and ginger. Okay, before we finish off this podcast, I think it's important to note the connection between aroma and memory. Smell and memory seem to be so closely linked together because of the brain's anatomy. Smells are handled by the olfactory bulb, right? That's the thing that does our different sense of smell. And the olfactory bulb is located in the limbic system. Odors take a direct route to the limbic system, and this means that it passes by the amygdala and the hippocampus, which are regions related to emotion and memory. So you are literally like, it's just because of the route that the odor takes to the olfactory bulb, it passes right by this amygdala and the hippocampus. And so you're basically creating a memory with that smell. So this is why a lot of times when you smell something, you might not be able to put a name to it because it didn't, right? The smell went to your limbic system, which is the determining the smell, but it didn't go to the front part of your brain, which does all that connecting to your dictionary in your head and deciding what it is. But it does wake up that memory area, right? Because we created a memory with the smell. So for me, an example of this is like when I used to smell certain wines, I would smell my dad's cologne. Could I tell you like what his cologne was? No, absolutely not. I had no idea, but it just gave me memories of my dad. I had another aroma. This happens a lot when it's not particularly in wine, but when I'm walking around the neighborhood in the springtime, I smell something that immediately takes me back to my childhood home. And that's because I smell lilac, and we had a big lilac bush in the back of our house. Another fun fact, smell is the only fully developed sense that a fetus has in the womb. And it's the one that is the most developed in a child through the age of around 10. And then that's when sight takes over. And because smell and emotion are stored as one memory, childhood tends to be the period in which you create the basis for smells you will like and hate for the rest of your life. So it's literally scientifically proven that you may come up with a memory before you'll ever come up with the actual name of a smell. Kind of cool, right? All right, so I get it. That was probably quite nerdy, but it's pretty darn cool, isn't it, to know where these aromas are coming from in your glass? I find it absolutely fascinating. If you know a wine lover in your life that would enjoy this episode, please share it with them. Find your favorite episode, send it their way, or take a screenshot right now of you listening to this podcast and post it on your social media. Tag me at Cork and Fizz. It would mean the world to me. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. I release new episodes every Wednesday. In next week's episode, I'll be sharing my top tips when it comes to serving wine. So this is everything from what temperature to serve your wine at, plus tips on how to chill it fast for, if you're like me and you forgot to put your wine glass your wine bottle in the fridge, which wine glasses to use for which wine, and does that even matter? How to buy wine for parties, decanting wine, and more. And hey, if you're sick of drinking the same wine over and over again, but you're maybe afraid to buy that new bottle at the store because you have no idea what to expect, don't worry, you're not alone. The wine world is incredibly overwhelming. Half the wine labels are in a different language, and then the ones that are in English just don't make any sense anyway. So if you're ready to feel more confident about your wine choices, come join my Cork crew. We will have you trying new wines every month, and you will be learning more and more about your style of wine and become confident ordering wine at a restaurant or buying new bottles at a wine shop. Head to corkandfizz.com/free class pass to come check out a tasting for free. I promise I'm not going to ask for your credit card. All I need is your email and you will get this free pass to come try a Cork Crew event. That is corkandfizz.com/free class pass. Cheers!